The guys that are here are some old friends, including Jesse James Dupree of Jackal, Jeff Blando, who plays in both Slaughter and Vince Neil's solo band. He's actually kind of the musical director of the whole deal. And also Mark Slaughter is here. And also, who else are we getting? George Lynch is here. We had George on just recently call in. He wanted to continue that conversation. So we'll grab George for a little bit. And we'll see who else wanders in and what else we get into over the course of these next 2 hours. Now, most of these guys I saw already because we're all at the same hotel. And this morning, the fire alarm went off in the hotel. So it was wonderful being evacuated from the hotel, standing in the parking lot in the scorching sun. Everybody had just woken up, and seeing George Lynch in his pajamas holding his teddy bear out there. He didn't have the teddy bear, but that truly happened. You see all of us standing out there waiting around and waiting to get the all clear to be able to go back into the hotel, which eventually we did. So anyway, it turned out to be quite a little adventure, but that's what happens on the road, and obviously not all that surprising given some of my recent history of stuff going on out there on the road when I do shows from remote locations. So it should be a lot of fun here today, and I'm looking forward to bringing you this show for the next couple hours and getting into whatever we get into with our various guests who will be dropping by. Wanted to update you guys a little bit more because we touched on this story the other day about the whole deal with Universal and those master tapes being burned. And I was mentioning that article, which was really fascinating, that was in the New York Times, was really, really lengthy. And I had a chance to read the entire article last night on the plane, and it is a really in-depth interview, or really, well, there's interviews with some of the people impacted, but also just the whole storyline is incredibly detailed and a very, very long interview. So it'd be impossible to read it all to you here on the radio, but going through it and hearing this story and now the ripple effect that it is having is pretty amazing, because a lot of these artists didn't know that their master tapes were destroyed. And Chris Novoselic from Nirvana just came out in light of this article and said, we just found out the master tapes for Nevermind have been destroyed. So what's happening now, 10 years after the fact, is that a lot of these artists are, because they didn't get the straight story from Universal about what happened, are now inquiring to find out if their tapes actually still exist. And this is a monumental loss in music history. It really is. You know, as I said, we're in this day and age now where people are, you know, they're listening to compressed files that sound like crap on streaming services for the most part. So a lot of people don't put a lot of stock into sonics and what stuff sounds like. The general public doesn't. But still, the loss of these master tapes is a gargantuan loss, and there are unreleased performances on it, the ability to separate the tracks and remix stuff, just the actual tapes, the actual way these records were recorded, going all the way back in some cases to the 40s, some of the blues and jazz greats of all time. A lot of that stuff lost right up till recordings with Nirvana, Soundgarden, and what have you. Now, what does it mean for you guys? Again, for most people, nothing, because you still got your CDs, you still got all your records, however you have them. You still have everything on the streaming services or whatever. But for the repurposing of the catalog, for the archival purposes, it's a huge, huge loss. It really is. And reading more through the article, which I had a chance to do finally, it's crazy because the entire Universal Music Group archives, one of their biggest places to store this stuff, was actually in the theme park in Universal City, California, like the Universal Studios theme park. They were saying that the main vault room that they were putting all of these precious archives was within walking distance to a King Kong ride or something. And the King Kong ride always was shooting fire out of its mouth like feet away from the building. They said the fire actually started because they were repairing some stuff on the roof, and they didn't wait long enough for the hot tar to completely form before they walked away from it, and that's how the fire actually started. But you would think these tapes would be taken care of in a much more safe place And they interviewed the guy that's his job was to look after them, and basically the labels got to the point where you could in having decades of archives like this, where they just, in this digital world, they're like, okay, if it's digitized, don't worry about it. Who cares? You just store it anywhere. Well, now they're realizing the incredible loss and the repercussions of doing it that way, and it's become a huge story. Irving Azoff, who manages the Eagles and Steely Dan and a bunch of acts, he wanted to make sure that his archives were absolutely, for Steely Dan, that those tapes actually existed and were there. So he actually made them produce the tapes, and it turned out their tapes had been moved to a different storage facility in like New Jersey or somewhere else. So those tapes are okay. But what's happening in light of this article is fascinating, because you have all of these artists whose catalogs have been acquired by Universal Music that are all now in a crazy scramble to say, hey, where are our tapes? What happened? Were they lost in that fire? Because they were not completely transparent about what actually happened on that day and how much was lost. And a caller yesterday to the show said the reason for that was because Universal is trying to sell 50% of their catalog. And they, the potential buyers, where it's worth billions of dollars, the potential buyers, they want to know that the masters exist. So they're trying to suppress the damage that actually had taken place. It's a huge story that the New York Times article has unraveled of something that happened 10 years ago, but people just never recognized the magnitude of until this story hit. So, and there's even not rumors, but there's even speculation as to maybe something like Appetite for Destruction could be gone for good. So it's a really, really crazy thing, because these recordings, whatever the source is, whether it be CD, whether it be vinyl, whether it be in the days of cassettes, whatever it is, it originates from those masters. And here's the other thing that I found fascinating in the article, okay? They said that the common thought is, with the rise of streaming, that so much is already on the streaming services, like, oh, well, music's all digitized, it's all good. There's digital versions of everything. We're fine. At least we have that. According to this article, only 18% of music has been digitized into digital formats. So there is a ton that wasn't, and that the only source material for it would be these master tapes. Now, honestly, I'm sure a large portion of the stuff that is not digitized yet is stuff that is fringe, that a lot of people would never want or would never hear or care about hearing. But it's still a really, really, really huge loss. It really is. And a really fascinating read. Ed, did you have anything else that because you chimed in on this yesterday, because I know you read the story too. Was there anything else that you picked up today? Because it's an ongoing story.
No, you pretty much hit the nail on its proverbial head. I mean, we've covered, Chris Novoselic came forward. I think Courtney Love talked about masters that belong to Hole as well. The Irving Azoff comment, and I mean, artists ranging from Questlove of the band The Roots, they lost masters in this debacle. That's pretty much it. Reading the article, it's amazing how little they had a guy that for 25 years was assigned to this room and looking after it and all that. And I mean, he's devastated about the whole thing, but it's amazing how little regard the labels, it almost became like a nuisance. These original recordings these masters became like a nuisance, because the common, we're in a streaming world, in a digital world, everybody, with the cloud, just clicking on something, getting something. But the reality is that there's a lot of music that isn't in those, digitized zones yet. And even if it is, the most pure, pristine way to get recordings and to hear them is from the master, what it was originally recorded to. And that is the only way you can really accurately remix things too, where you can break them out into individual tracks, isolate the tracks, do remixes, do special editions and stuff. Well, not only that, but on top of that, we're talking about the original sessions from these albums. So alternate takes, breakdowns, as you alluded to. I mean, hours upon hours of material that was never mixed and released commercially anyway, but that in terms of a retrospective box set, or just the fact that this is a treasure trove of music history that is now, or was, up in flames.
Yeah. And as the formats evolve, and you get the resurfacing of vinyl recently, people were always like, well, we want the vinyl mastered from the original source, taken from the original source. Well, if those recordings were burned up, that's not possible anymore. The source is going to have to be whatever sources exist, whether it be CD or whatever. I told you, there's been plenty of records that have been remastered from like CDs and what have you as the original source material. But it's a really, really fascinating read, and I'll pump out the link to the full article if you guys haven't had a chance to read it yet.
If you want to check it out.
It's on the series. Yeah. At Sirius XM volume.
Exactly. One thing I do want to correct you on, and this is fascinating because the Universal Studios theme park and the actual Universal Studios are one and the same entity in Hollywood, California. So in essence, this warehouse was kind of smack dab between this King Kong attraction and the backlot, including the famous courthouse area used in the Back to the Future movies.
Yeah, there are other storage facilities, including one. They talked about some of the other places that they're at, but it's just a lot of people just didn't think that it would be that they would locate stuff that's of such value in a place like that. But it is it's having repercussions now, because you could imagine if you are an artist and the labels own these masters, and that's the other thing too. Labels own masters for a certain. Depending upon the nature of the deal, either forever, or there's been this new ordinance that's come down where after, I think it's 30 years, in some contracts, master tapes can revert back to the artist. And that's something you really want if you're an artist, because if your masters, you may have heard that term before, where masters revert back, meaning that for 30 years or so, the record company owns your master recordings and can do whatever they want with them. But then after a certain period of time, contractually or legally, the masters then go back to the people who created them. And one of the really important things, and why some of these artists are also really concerned about this for good reason, is because if you're waiting for your masters to revert back to you, when they do, that's when you want to strike and do your special edition reissues, because then you're making the money and you can control it. You want a perfect example of that? Metallica. What do you think is happening now? Metallica in the last few years started Blackened Records, and you have already seen Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Injustice for All reissued for 30th anniversary reissues on their own label. Remastered, extra tracks, all of that. All of that material comes from the original master tapes. And the artists are wanting to do this because obviously they control it. They own it. They make the money from it. They would much rather have the control of doing that than their old record label, because then the old record label has all the control and makes the money. So if you are an artist and you say you had your tapes under the guidance and care of Universal, and they're going to you're waiting for that day when they revert to you and you can run with it and market all this and reissue it, and then all of a sudden you call up and it's like, okay, it's 30 years, give me my tapes. We don't have them, they burned up. That's another thing you're not going to be too happy about. So it's got a lot of ripples to it, this story. Again, at the end of the day, the regular person listening to their music, streaming, CDs, vinyl, whatever, that's all there. That's not going anywhere. There's thousands and thousands and millions of copies of that stuff out there. But just for future archives, for having the original source material, it is a devastating blow to the music industry, and is something that's continually talked about, just because the severity of it has been suppressed for the last 10 years until this article just hit.